It's the IDP Show, now you know.
Welcome to a very special edition of the IDP Show. Josh Raymer here in the Sode Shack with Scott Soltis, Professor IDP. In this episode, we are talking about 2024 IDP MVP. Scott, for reasons that are going to be described by the various analysts that submitted clips in this episode, these were IDPs that we loved having on our roster in 2024. We just wrapped up the holiday season, Christmas and New Year's. I would think of these guys as a gift for IDP managers all season long.
Yeah, and also very likely a gift at the end of the season, too, and helping people win some championships, go into the offseason with some of that nice momentum. So lots of great submissions of players that not only fun to watch, but also helped a lot of players win a whole lot of games this season.
And some good variety, too. I think when we both sat down and thought about who were going to be the popular submissions for this year's show, a couple names came to mind, and we do see those players well represented, but we have 22 analysts who submitted clips, including ourselves, and 11 players nominated across all three position groups. I thought that was pretty cool kind of representation for IDP.
Yeah, I was very nervous because, I have a little bit of a bias towards the very big guys.
Just a little bit, just a little bit.
When I was thinking about my person who we'll get to in a little bit, I was like, I'm going to be on an island. There's no one else. So to see his name pop up and some other people was very, very reassuring that it's not just my biases that were showing.
Yeah, so I was thinking, are we going to get any DBs? Is the fade DB kind of hate going to come back and keep us from nominating some of these guys? I went with a DB. I'll share mine at the end, but we also had a couple other DBs get some love as well. So all of the position groups represented here in the IDP MVP episode. Like I mentioned, we had 22 analysts, including myself and Scott, submit their picks for IDP MVP. So what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to tee up each player that has been nominated. You will see the clips from those analysts explaining why they chose that player. And then Scott and I will come back on and give our thoughts on that guy before moving on to the next player. So, Scott, we got a lot of awesome clips, a lot of good stuff to get through. So what do you say we jump right into it with the first nomination?
Yeah, I'm excited for it.
And this is one of the names I think we both expected to see on this list quite a bit. And it is the long-haired beauty from the Minnesota Vikings, the edge rusher, Andrew Van Ginkel, goes from Miami to Minnesota. He was one of our kind of darlings going into the 2024 season here on this show, Scott. I think he exceeded even the wildest expectations for Vikings fans, for AVG fans, for IDP managers in 2024.
Absolutely. When we saw Dallas Turner get drafted, we had no idea what was going to end up happening here. So people who drafted him and had that faith were definitely very well rewarded in the 2024 season.
Very richly rewarded. But let's jump into it with these clips. So for this player, Andrew Van Ginkel, we had submissions from Jeff Pomazal, John Macri, Tom Kislingberry, and Trip Brebner, Dynasty Trip. So, gentlemen, take it away.
So I'm on here to talk fantasy football IDP MVPs. And normally with these, I'd go linebacker. Pretty simple. Why? You see a linebacker break out in week one the way Zack Baun did, and it's a player that you can confidently chase either on the waiver wire or revel in the fact that you drafted him late and start the rest of the way. But this year, I'll go a little bit different and choose Andrew Van Ginkel. You all might not recall this, but a couple of years ago, I was on the IDP show, and we talked about the Dolphins' edge rotation. Jalen Phillips. This was before Bradley Chubb got there, I think, but we talked about what role, if any, that Andrew Van Ginkel might have in Miami after having started as a fairly unspectacular edge in this third season under Brian Flores. And he would come back to rotate with Jalen Phillips, I think, the following year. Anyhow, y'all had correctly called him Rip Van Winkle, or Andrew Van Winkle. You tabbed him as a dynasty sleeper, so congratulations on that. I will nominate him as my fantasy football MVP. He is the leader among edge defenders in scoring at footballguys.com, and he has come farther out of left field than any number one overall scorer at that position in football, guys, in a few years. The last one I can think of that's similar is Hassan Reddick, who for the Cardinals switched positions and took the top spot in football guys scoring back in 2020. And Van Ginkel has done something similar. It's really remarkable that he started off as a nickel off-ball linebacker in week 1 of 2023 and has now shown up here in Minnesota back with Brian Flores and has just become just a fixture in fantasy rosters. I'm thankful that he has helped contribute to a championship on my end as well. So that's my nomination, Andrew Van Ginkel, outside linebacker and edge defender for the Minnesota Vikings. Hope you all have a wonderful 2025, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. Thank you now.
Hello, Jeff Pumsall here to give you my candidate for the IDP MVP for 2024. There are so many worthy candidates, it was a little difficult to pick just one. So I went with a player who was not drafted anywhere near the top of their prospective positions back in August. Not a lot of people were talking about this guy. Someone who was on a new team and someone who played their college ball in Madison as a Badger. You're probably thinking that my candidate is going to be Zack Baun, but it's actually Andrew Van Ginkel. Now, Baun is very worthy of this nomination, but I'm going to give it to Van Ginkel because of the position that he plays and the advantage that he gave you over other players at that position. If we compare the top 12 defensive linemen versus the top 12 linebackers, we see Baun having 243 points in Big Three scoring. And if we compare that to the number 12 linebacker, Robert Spillane, he had 204. That's a difference of 43 points. Now, AVG scored 237 points. And if you compare that to the top number 12 defensive lineman, Greg Rousseau, and his 169 points, that's a difference of 68 points. That's a huge advantage over your opponent on a week-to-week basis. Speaking of an advantage over your opponent, AVG had 5 weeks where he had 20 or more fantasy points. That's a legit weekly winner there for your lineup. Unlike other defensive linemen who sometimes give you a goose egg throughout the season, AVG never did that to their managers. And so he did have one game against Chicago where he was a little banged up and questionable coming into it, but he still had 2 tackles. So unless you're playing in a best ball format, he probably wasn't going to be in your lineup anyway, being hobbled the entire week of practice. Now, AVG had a great season under Brian Flores in that defense in Minnesota, one that saw him have a total of 69 combined tackles, 11 sacks, 1 forced fumble, 2 interceptions, and 2 defensive touchdowns. That is why, as much as it pains me to say it as a Packer fan to give it to a Viking, Andrew Van Ginkel is going to be my IDP MVP for the 2024 season.
Hey folks, John Macri here to give you my 2024 IDP MVP. It's always difficult to narrow it down to just one name for the entire season, and I'm sure there are going to be plenty covered here in the episode today. So that'll cover some of the bases, especially for like guys like Zack Baun, who I'm sure is going to be a popular pick. But I wanted to go with a guy that I think really deserves this award above all else, and is also a name that I don't think anyone would have considered being an option for MVP coming into this season, because I'm going to go with the absolute long-haired beauty of the Minnesota Vikings, Andrew Van Ginkel. Now, I'm starting to think that there is like some magic associated with long-haired players in the NFL where it allows them, you know, for special performances, to the point where I'm considering maybe growing out my own hair to that length to see if I can develop some kind of special powers myself. Who knows? But it feels like there's something to it, especially considering that 2 of our other long-haired beauties in Alex Kinkleton and Alex Anzalone suffered injuries that took them out for most of this year, which is curious, right? Like maybe there's some long-haired black magic done by the new king, AVG himself, that allowed him to sap the power away from Anzalone and Singleton, causing their injuries and taking all the power for himself. Because how the hell else did this former 5th round pick finish as the overall edge 1 on the season, at least for the PFF scoring here? Impressive stuff altogether. Now, Gink, he was not a highly drafted IDP coming into the year, though he wasn't like ignored either after a strong season in 2023, but he was also going to a new team that just so happened to spend a 1st round pick on a player at his very position, while also adding Jonathan Greenard this offseason. So understandably, expectations were relatively tempered for him to have a repeat of 2023, but not only did he live up to his 2023 expectations, but he greatly outperformed. And it was evident that he was going to be an IDP relevant option all season long, right away in week 1 when he delivered a sack and a pick six in the first week of the season. And he basically never looked back from that point on, delivering 11 and a half sacks, 72 total tackles, 5 pass breakups, 19 QB hits, a forced fumble, and even added one more pick six in there to give him 2 on the year. The guy was an absolute stud almost every week and had a great production floor that is hard to find at this position to go along with many big plays, ultimately finishing second at the position in points per game behind only the legend that is Aiden Hutchinson. We were robbed of a truly special season by Hutch, by the way, but I'll cry more about that later, because for now, it's all about AVG, Gink, Andrew Van Ginkel as my 2024 IDP MVP.
So I got asked to submit thoughts on IDP MVP again, and that always gets me thinking, what are the criteria? What does it actually mean? So I think I've got 5. Number 1, you got to score a lot of IDP points. Seems fairly basic. Number 2, you can't just be volume driven. I don't want some guy that's just played 1,200 snaps and the points come from that. They've got to be delivered by doing something special and interesting. You've got to score a lot more points than I expected. If you were a superstar and I thought you were a superstar, sure, that's really good, but you had to pay through the nose to get it. So how valuable is it to your team winning? You've got to be consistently productive. I need you to be good in most weeks, not have a couple of amazing weeks where you may well have been on the bench and a load of fairly average weeks. And you've got to be an actually good NFL player. I'm not going to give this award to people I don't think are good at football that happen to score a load of points. So with all that in mind, my MVP is Andrew Van Ginkel for the year, which I'm absolutely astonished to be saying, but by the criteria I've put down, I'm probably always going to be astonished. So Van Ginkel was, depending on his scoring, joint top edge, up there with TJ Watt, right at the top of the scoring chart. So he had a load of points, number 2 in tackles, number 3 in sacks, although he was only number 25 in pressures. He converted a lot of relatively small amount, but he had all those. We didn't have quite as much pressure because he was asked to do a lot. He was playing a lot in coverage. He played probably 50 snaps more than any other edge in coverage. So a real versatile, interesting role, which floats my boat. And he had a couple of interceptions that went along with that. And then pre-season, I had him about number 40 edge, I think, something like that. So he clearly delivered above and beyond. So well done, Van Ginkel. Thought he was a stud. Other players on my shortlist, Zach Allen was really good, but it was volume driven. He basically played a lot more than anybody else at the position. Alontae Taylor, Saints corner, who is not good. He's a bad NFL player, so I'm not going to go for him. Budda Baker had a few massive weeks, well above of all of the other safeties in terms of tackling, but it was just driven by a few good weeks and a lot of average weeks. And Zack Baun was very close to winning first season as a linebacker on the Eagles. All of those were really good for lots of different reasons, but MVP was Andrew Van Ginkel. Happy New Year.
So there you go, Scott. 4 different people thought Andrew Van Ginkel was the IDP MVP. And I think they made a strong case. And I think the number one thing that stands out to me from these clips was the value on AVG, right? This was a player who a lot of our stud edge rushers let us down. I mean, some of them, Myles Garrett, TJ Watt held strong, but it was the AVGs of the world that really, I think, delivered in a big way for managers, because when you get that player who ends up top 5 at their position and you drafted them well past that range in most of your drafts, that's the makeup for a lot of league winning rosters right there.
Absolutely. And just imagine you could have paired AVG with a TJ Watt or a Micah Parsons or someone that you took in the first couple of rounds, and suddenly, those edges that did perform, I know Parsons was hurt a little bit some of the year, but those edges that did perform really well, having those with that value play as well is just amazing in terms of your point outputs.
Yeah, and then you also factor in something like dual designation for AVG on sleepers, so he becomes even more of a cheat code. And I wanted to look it up here because we talk about value a lot, and you mentioned, you could have even potentially stacked someone like Nick Bosa, Myles Garrett, Micah Parsons, TJ Watt with an AVG. All those guys, first-round selections in IDP-only best ball drafts that we ran this offseason. But then you look at Van Ginkel, he was going as edge 36, DL 47, ADP of 83.8 overall post-draft. Once we saw that Dallas Turner selection, he dropped 10 spots, almost a full round by ADP. So 93.6 overall, that's what, like an 8th round selection? So you could have gotten this guy in the 8th round. And again, as dual designation on Sleeper, I mean, I promise you, if you look at IDP rosters that won titles across Sleeper's platform, you're going to see a lot of AVG in there.
Yeah, and the only slight hiccup with AVG was the end of the season.
End of the season, yep, agreed.
And, you know, it's hard to wash that taste out of your mouth because I had him in a championship matchup. And, you know, he performed okay in the week 17, had a great week 16 with a multi-sack game, which is... So I have to remember and compartmentalize that, wait, he's why I got to the championship to begin with. So even though he had a couple of less than stellar weeks there to end the season, you know, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have been in that position to be playing for a championship to begin with. So absolutely a very, very worthy selection for IDP MVP 2024.
Andrew Van Ginkel, the first player nominated. The next one here is a solo nominated by Justin Varnes of Fantasy Points. It is a DB, and it's a DB who played very well in the fantasy playoffs. Brandon Jones, take it away, Mr. Varnes.
What's up, guys? It's Justin Varnes from FantasyPoints.com. This is my IDP MVP for the season. That's going to be safety Brandon Jones. Now, that was somebody that I had my eye on heading into the season who I thought was going to be a real value. You could get him super late. I think IDP Show, ADP had him in, I think it was around 44, 45, something like that. Basically, most people wasn't even drafting this guy even in 3 and 4 DB leagues. He had a really rough season in Miami last year, playing with Vic Fangio's defense, got injured, also just wasn't playing a lot of snaps. Basically thought he wasn't working out well. I thought he was going to be a great fit for the Denver Broncos, and that he was. He was incredibly consistent through 15 games. He's got 114 tackles, also put up some nice big play stats. He had 3 interceptions, a couple of tackles for loss. I think one of the big things I love about what he did, though, was his consistency. He had 8 tackles, I think at least 7 times over the course of the season. And when you needed him the most, he came through. Week 15, 9 tackles. Week 16, 10 tackles. Week 17 in the championship, 13 tackles. That's what you want to see out of your DBs. You could have picked him up off the scrap heap. He's going to be a top 10, maybe even a top 5 DB, depending on your scoring. My IDP MVP, Denver Broncos safety, Brandon Jones.
Brandon Jones was a playoff hero for rosters, Scott. Finished with, I believe, 32 tackles from weeks 15 through 17. And again, we talked about value with Andrew Van Ginkel. Brandon Jones, DB 43, safety 31 by our ADP, and is going to, we're recording this here on Saturday before week 18 kicks off. He is sitting tied for safety 4 overall with Jesse Bates right now. So not a bad season from Brandon Jones.
No, and you love to see a career high in tackles in week 17.
Right.
13 tackles, combined tackles in week 17 is just an absolutely fantastic way to end your season. I've liked Brandon Jones for a long time. I have him in a bunch of my dynasty leagues. I usually tend to trade away or cut safeties, but I keep him, and I'm very glad that I did, especially for, again, those dynasty leagues at the end of the season. Just phenomenal point outputs, great tackle numbers, season long. Really only 1 week all season where you might have been a little bit disappointed if you played him, week 13 against the Browns with only 3 combined tackles and a pass defended. But every single other week he was either at or hovering right around that 10-point mark, with several weeks at 20 and even a couple at 30, depending on your scoring system. So Brandon Jones, another very worthy candidate.
Absolutely. And you love to see the DBs represented. We're going to keep that theme going here, Scott, with Arn Evers' selection. He went with another defensive back, and this was the guy. As good as Brandon Jones was in the fantasy playoffs, this guy was even better. Of the Detroit Lions, one of our favorites, Brian Branch. Arn, tell us why he is your 2024 IDP MVP.
G'day guys, I'm Aaron and I'm one of the content producers here at the IDP Show. I'm here under duress to provide you with my IDP MVP. I thought about this for a long time and made my way through different guys before finally settling on my guy, and that's Brian Branch. As soon as I thought about him, I knew he was the guy for me. Now, Branch is currently the DB1 on the season, and with a meaningless Week 18 game left to play, even if he puts up 0 points against the Vikings, he will have put up just the 5th 250-point-plus season by a DB in the past 3 years. If he puts up his season average, which is over 16 points per game, he has a shot at being the only guy in that 3-year time span to put up 265 plus points outside of Antoine Winfield last year. His body of work may draw criticism because Branch has had 4 straight games of 9 points or less in the middle of the season and 9.5 or less in 6 out of 7 games in that middle of the season section. Now, personally, I chalk that up to variance at the DB position. 9 points, it's not killing your roster. The main reason for Branch for me and my selection was he came up big when you needed him. His 18-point game on Monday, combined with his work in weeks 15 and 16, it made him the highest scoring DB in the playoffs in 2024 and the 5th highest scoring IDP in that playoff stretch with 21.8 points per game. He was a difference maker at the position, over 2.5 points per game better than any other safety, and 2 points per game better than the DB overall 2, who was Keyshawn Nixon. It wasn't just the IDP fantasy points. Branch's play was reflected in his PFF grading. He was a top 8 graded safety per PFF. He was an absolute missile in the run game, leading to him being top 4 in solo tackles at the position, and he was a ball hawk against the pass, finishing both top 6 in interceptions and passes defended on the season. He's the complete player. His clutch factor is through the roof, and that's why Brian Branch is my IDP MVP for 2024.
Brian Branch was a maniac for the Detroit Lions in the playoffs for fantasy football, Scott. 14 tackles, 12 tackles, 7 tackles, and a sack in Week 17. 24, 23, and 18 points by Big 3 scoring. This was a guy who absolutely, I think, won you a title because you had to invest early in Brian Branch. He was DB5 by our ADP. But he's a guy that if you're going to be a stud and show up on this list at the end of the season, you have to play well in the fantasy playoffs. I think those two go hand in hand. Brian Branch fits that mold.
Yeah, and what I love about those numbers from Branch is their fantastic IDP output before you remember that he's a DB.
That's right.
Like if you had a linebacker with those numbers in the last 3 weeks of the season, you would be pretty darn happy about that. So the fact that he is a DB, and if you're in leagues that require corner and he's designated as a corner and have CB premium scoring,
cheat code,
even more to the moon for him.
Yep.
So Brian Branch, absolutely, I'm certain, won a lot of people their leagues this year. And another fun player to watch, too. He's one of those people who your eye is just drawn to whenever you're watching Lions games. And they've been getting a lot of nationally televised games and in a very banged-up defense where there's not as many guys to watch as we like to normally, with Hutchinson out and Ayla McNeil, who is one of my
one of your babies.
Favorites. But your eye is just drawn to Branch and the amazing stuff that he does when he's on the field.
Yeah, he is. It was kind of a tale of... not a tale of two halves. It was kind of like a sandwich, right? Except if the sandwich was inverted and the best stuff was on the outside. Didn't KFC do that once? The double-decker?
Double down.
Double down,
yeah.
Yes. The heart attack on a plate. Yes, because Branch went the first 5 weeks of the season. He missed the Seattle game, and they had their bye week in Week 5. But if you look at the first 5 games that he played, 22, 21, 21, 38, 19 points by Big 3 scoring. Little bit of a slump there in the middle of the season, a lot of single-digit outputs, but then, like I said, 24.5, 23, and 17.95 points in the playoffs. So if you had the guts, and I think you would have had the guts to start Brian Branch because you probably drafted him highly, and so I don't know that a lot of folks would have had the stones, but you never know. You could have been able to scoop up someone like a Dane Belton and thought, do I roll out Dane Belton over Brian Branch going into my fantasy playoffs? Do I go with a Trayvon Merrick or someone like that? So I don't know. Maybe some managers sat Brian Branch down, but given what folks paid to get this guy, I'm hoping he was in a lot of starting lineups for folks.
I'm thinking he was. I don't even remember seeing his name come up very much in start-sit decisions on the Sunday morning shows. Because he is just that guy who has that pedigree who, like you said, some of it, you can have a sunk cost fallacy of drafting someone too high and then staying with them for too long. But given how much Branch performed for people through significant stretches of the season, and especially in those playoffs, I can't imagine someone seeing his 8 tackle, 8 solo, 2 TFL, 6 assist, pass defended game in Week 15 and thinking, I might want to look somewhere else in Week 16.
Right.
So I'm sure he rewarded lots of managers who stuck with him, and hopefully they did. And he's very much another IDP MVP for 2024.
And he will be highly drafted again in 2025,
Absolutely.
especially off the back of this performance. I feel like a lot of times, we talked about this a little bit on the last episode, Jake and I did, that you tend to remember the beginning of the season because that's when, at least the public does, the market tends to remember the beginning of the season because a lot of folks check out after Halloween if their team's out of it, right? They don't catch the back half of the season. Or you tend to remember the playoffs because someone went crazy and won you a championship. So there's sort of like this peak end theory going on a little bit of like, we remember the peaks, remember the ends. And Brian Branch fits both, right? He had both ends of his season. The start and the finish both were excellent. So I think Brian Branch, it's hard to go up from DB5 in the ADP. He just might do it off the back of this performance. So let's move to our next choice here. And it's no surprise. If you know Bobby Reynolds, you know who this nomination was going to. No, it was not Jared Verse. If we were having a Defensive Rookie of the Year conversation, that would be where Bobby would go. But he is going with a linebacker who was on 3 different teams in the past year. It is Ernest Jones. Bobo, tell us why Ernest Jones is your IDP MVP.
IDP Bob here with my 2024 IDP Show MVP. It might be a guy that you're not thinking about. I know over this episode you've probably heard a lot of Zack Baun talk, maybe some AVG, a little Devon Witherspoon, some guys that the IDP Show, Adam, Josh, myself, some other characters have probably talked a lot about in 2024. But I want to talk to you about a linebacker who's performed pretty well under the radar and under a lot of scrutiny. Traveled a ton in 2024. But first, let's go back and look at his 2023 stats. In 2023, played for the same team, 15 games, 145 total tackles, 4.5 sacks, 14 TFLs. Led this team really great from the interior, was a really, really good pass rusher. I believe also had 2 sacks in the postseason last year. But then let's look to 2024. Let's look at the stats. They are a little bit less than 2023, but they're still really, really solid for what this guy went through. 129 total tackles, 4 TFLs, and an interception in 2024. Played his first several games in Tennessee, finished the rest of his season, I believe, right around the bye week for Seattle. My IDP Show MVP for 2024 is Ernest Jones. I know it's probably a name that you've heard me talk about a lot. It's not necessarily a guy that has performed elite in 2024, but it's just a guy who was a really, really solid LB2 for us. We plugged him into a lot of our lineups. We expected a lot of regression from him, honestly, because the change in scenery, the new defensive coordinators, the new defensive schemes, playing with other players, just the guy went through a ton in 2024. But man, Ernest Jones really held his head up. I think that in the offseason, you're going to find out the IDP Show, myself, Josh, and Adam are going to talk about this guy a lot. He is really going to be my heartthrob, my true MVP if Seattle does the right thing and gives him a 3-year extension. I'd love to see Ernest Jones settle down for a little while, get back to those 2023 pass rush snaps specifically, get to the quarterback, put up those high tackle numbers for us. Ernest Jones, well, I will love him forever. 2024 IDP Show MVP. Peace out, guys.
Scott, I don't know how I would respond to being in 3 different workplaces in the span of, I don't know, say about 6 months. But Ernest Jones found himself in that place, going from the Rams to the Titans originally, and then from the Titans to the Seahawks. We're still waiting to see if Ernest gets the bag at some point this offseason. You didn't quite see the ceiling outcomes for Ernest, but he was pretty consistent in terms of delivering tackles, and I think he exceeded my expectations when it came to his performance, given that, again, a lot of new surroundings, new situations, new teammates, coaches, schemes, opponents. I think he did the best with kind of a bad hand that he was dealt this season.
Yeah, I was kind of skittish on Jones at various points during the season because of all that movement and just not knowing how he was going to fit in. And like you said, even though he didn't really have any boom game, he didn't really have many terrible games either. He was a very steady guy who, when you started him week over week over week, you were getting reliably consistent performances, other than those last 2 weeks, which again might leave a bit of a sour taste in some folks' mouths. But, Ernest Saves IDP was the joke as he was moving around, because there was even a chance at one point he would have no bye, depending on who he ended up going to. And that, super cheat code there, having all those games to count. But, regardless of where he was and what scheme he was in and which coordinators he had, he performed. And that's a hallmark of a pretty darn good IDP asset for you.
Yeah, Bobo brings up that he was just a solid LB2 that we could plug into lineups. And I think if you kind of have that in your mind of readjusting expectations, because we saw Ernest go as LB5. He was a late second-round pick in best ball drafts. But then the movement happens, right? I think he literally got traded. We were doing the Green Dot episode with Mike Wohlert before the season started, and that news broke. And so he was traded right before the season started. We had to cover that news on the pod. So I think there was people drafted him with the expectation of him being that LB1 for the Rams. Mm-hmm. And so I think this required a little bit of adjusting your expectations. And I think as long as you reset your expectations, because I think if you were expecting Ernest to be a top 5 LB on a new team and then another new team, that was your fault. That was your own kind of mistake in keeping those assumptions the same. I'm glad that Ernest was not only usable for IDP this year, but pretty solid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, a very reliable guy.
Yep.
Like Bobby was saying, you can always count on him to have an LB2 performance. Probably not going to be the LB1 in a given week, but probably also not going to drop into that LB3, LB4 territory. Not going to put up a 0 week for you didn't do that at all this season, other than the one game missed due to injury, but we don't count that as a real 0. So, yeah, just a reliable guy regardless of time and situation.
This was a guy who was drafted as LB5, could have very well finished as LB45 given the circumstances, and he didn't. So shout out to Ernest Jones, and thank you, Bobo, for that nomination. Let's talk about a guy, though, at linebacker who was a massive value. If we look at the ADP, this guy was going as LB. You ready for this, Scott? 127. 373, which I think is the number that we have in the ADP when he's just not being drafted at all in drafts, right? So this guy came into the league as a safety. He was this kind of tweener type, weird linebacker, safety hybrid, and found a role on the New York Jets defense as C.J. Mosley had to step aside due to injury. Alongside Quincy Williams, this guy was a tremendous presence in the middle of that defense for the New York Jets. It is Jamien Sherwood, and to talk up Mr. Sherwood, we have John Glosser from Dynasty Nerds. So the floor is yours, Mr. Glosser.
Hello, gentlemen. It is your favorite Dynasty nerd, John Glosser. Grateful to be here and kind of give you guys my MVP for the season. In IDP, linebacker is king. I'm going to go with Jamien Sherwood this year. Kind of a afterthought, a deep stash, if not waiver wire in most of your leagues. Was just really special this year. After the CJ Mosley injury, came on and, be honest, just outperformed Mosley. Even when Mosley tried to kind of work his way back, I think the Jets realized very quickly that they had their linebacker of the future. Sherwood only being 24 years old, that is great for future IDP dynasty managers. Sherwood was the IDP 14 in total fantasy points per game this year, averaged 9 tackles per game in the fantasy playoffs, which is what we want when our season's on the line and it's a win or go home scenario. We got that production out of him. That was great to see. Linebacker 7 in fantasy points per game overall, 3rd in tackles per game entering week 18. Only Zack Baun and Zaire Franklin outscored him this year. So Jamien Sherwood is the MVP pick for the IDP nerds this year. Hope you guys had a great season. Really looking forward to the show. And it's a new year. Dynasty never stops. So let's get back to work and, get ready for next year. Later, guys.
I think the biggest compliment that we can give to Jamien Sherwood, Scott, is that you're able to keep, I won't say a legend, but a very solid, reliable, well-paid veteran like C.J. Mosley off the field. I mentioned this in our last episode. Adam brought this up, and it kind of caught me off guard earlier in the season when he said it on our show. He said, C.J. Mosley isn't getting that job back. This is Sherwood's job. And I thought, you crazy. They're giving Mosley that job back. And Jamien Sherwood sent C.J. Mosley to the bench, and then C.J. Mosley went to IR with the neck injury. And I think this team had a lot of issues, Scott. I don't think linebacker play was one of them, in large part because of what we got from Jamien Sherwood.
No, and this just really shows you the low risk, high reward of taking that LB3 in a really productive LB defense.
Right.
We all thought this was going to be Williams and Mosley. We knew Sherwood had talent, but like you said, is that tweener safety role, not knowing exactly what we would get out of him. So if, especially in like a best ball environment, or if you're doing weekly managed leagues and you pick them up in waivers, or just as a guy to have, give me the LB3 in systems that are pretty consistently producing two high quality output linebackers. Sherwood was that guy. He ended up leading the league in solo tackles, which is incredible because he was, had some limited action before Mosley got hurt. Mosley played a couple snaps when he came back, but like you said, once Sherwood took the job, he ran with it and never looked back, and he definitely paid off for people who had the foresight to get that LB3 in New York, and then just a little bit of misfortune for C.J. Mosley led to a great opportunity for Sherwood, which he absolutely took advantage of.
Well, you look at this list of players that we're going to go through on this episode, and there's one other guy that you could say, depending on the depth of your league, might not have been drafted, but he was at least getting buzz building up to the season. It was just a matter of did we buy into it or not. Jamien Sherwood was not on really anyone's rosters other than as a high upside linebacker handcuff. And so when you see this kind of guy come through and put up the performance that he did, which you saw some really nice ceiling games from him. You had week 9 against Houston. He had 2 sacks, 7 tackles, 27.85 points, a big 3 scoring. Week 14, if you needed a big performance to get into the playoffs, he delivered with 18 tackles for 30 points, Scott. So just consistently on the field, really took that job from like week 2 on. He was playing 50 or more snaps the rest of the season. And just a very profitable scheme for linebackers. Mm-hmm. That scheme in large part is why C.J. Mosley and Quincy Williams were highly drafted guys. And, there's not often that we talk about handcuffs in IDP. I think you can handcuff linebacker. And if you were bold enough to be one of those folks that drafted Jamien Sherwood, you got basically a free square in your best ball drafts.
Yeah, and you love the fact that he's constantly out there too. So as you mentioned, Mosley got hurt in week 2. From week 3 on, the lowest snap share he had was 87%, and that was an anomaly. He was more typically in that 98, 99 with a 100 sprinkled in there too. So he was out there, he had that consistency, and that translated to his IDP fantasy output as well. So that's what we like to see. It's great to get snaps. It's even better to do things with those snaps consistently, and Sherwood absolutely did that for his managers in 2024.
Absolutely. Another guy who did the most with his snaps. We're going to go to Atlanta for this one, Scott, and talk about a player who 3 different analysts nominated, I think in large part because of the playoff performance that we saw from this guy. Some outrageous production. We'll talk about it here after you hear from these clips, but you're going to hear about Kaden Elliss from Jace, Abby, Johnny the Greek, and Patrick, a.k.a. Tackle Box Props from RPO. So, gentlemen, the floor is yours. Tell us why Kaden Elliss was your IDP MVP.
Johnny the Greek here. My IDP MVP for this season is Kaden Elliss. So not only was Kaden Elliss the linebacker 4 overall through week 17 in many, the vast majority of my leagues, but he also showed up for us when it mattered most. Week 15, start of playoffs, 11 combined tackles, 1 sack, 1 tackle for loss. Week 16, semifinals, 7 combined tackles, 1 sack, 1 forced fumble, 1 tackle for loss. Week 17, finals, 9 combined tackles, 1 sack, 1 tackle for loss. So I was able to draft Ellis late in many leagues as a linebacker 2 or linebacker 3, as the preseason hype around him wasn't as loud as many others, and there were some concerns with Landman and Troy Anderson there. But it worked out great because on the season he has 0 single-digit games, and that's in many of my leagues where we have big 3 scoring or similar. He was never injured, no shenanigans, just consistent production for the entire season in huge games during the entire playoff run. That's an IDP MVP in my books. Kaden Elliss.
There are quite a few players that I would consider IDP MVPs this season. It's tough to narrow it down to just one, but for my choice, I'm going to factor in my own ownership across my leagues. In my 2 main home leagues, this player was drafted as LB38 and LB51 and finished the season as LB3 and LB4 respectively. This player also never hurt you in any single week, as he never once had a single game where he scored under 10 points. I'm sure Zack Baun will be a popular pick here, as he should be. He was drafted well below this player and finished ahead of him in scoring this season. But the real reason that I went with this player over Zack Baun is due to playoff performance. This guy was the top scoring linebacker in weeks 15 through 17 and did it with consistency, scoring 25, 27, and 28 points over that 3-week span. To top it off, he also finished with 25 points in week 14 to help any teams that needed it get to the playoffs. That player and my 2024 nomination for IDP MVP is Atlanta Falcons linebacker Kaden Elliss.
Hey all, Jace here, and I'm here to award my IDP MVP to Kaden Elliss of the Atlanta Falcons. He's been on fire this year, helping many of us to a fantasy championship, and one of the main reasons he's done that, and really what became the deciding factor between him and a bunch of other worthy candidates, is that Elliss has been red hot during the fantasy playoffs. From week 13 onwards, he's done what he's always done best, getting after the quarterback on his way to collecting a sack in 4 straight games. That took his sack total to 5 on the season, which is 3rd among all linebackers, and incidentally only 1 behind the sack leaders for the Falcons, Arnold Ebiketie and Matthew Judon, despite both having more than double the pass rush snaps that Elliss has had. But the difference between the 2023 version of Elliss and what we've seen this year is that he's not just been a source of big plays, he's also been a very reliable source of tackles. And despite rushing the passer more than any other off-ball linebacker not named Frankie Louvu or Blake Cashman, and despite playing fewer snaps than he did last year, Elliss ranks 7th among all linebackers and 8th among all players with a career-high 136 tackles. Now there's 2 main reasons why he's reached that figure. Firstly, his 13.2% tackle rate is really healthy, ranking 43rd out of 123 at the position. And secondly, he's also been the picture of consistency. He hasn't missed a game. In fact, he's barely missed a snap. And perhaps most impressively, there's only 2 weeks where he's finished with fewer than 7 tackles in a game. But if we still needed more reasons to like what Elliss has done, he's also forced a fumble, recovered a fumble, had an interception, and added 2 pass breakups. And while his 43 pressures won't have counted for fantasy purposes, I wanted to bring it up because it gives me a chance to mention that he's only 4 behind TJ Watt in that category. So for all of those reasons, I'm nominating Kaden Elliss, the 5th ranked LB in Big 3 scoring, as my IDP MVP in 2024.
Scott, Kaden Elliss falls into an interesting bucket of linebackers in that he wasn't a stud. He wasn't a top 5 drafted guy at the position. He wasn't this outrageous value like we just saw with Jamien Sherwood, and we'll talk about with another linebacker here in a moment. He was one of those LB3, LB4 kind of fringe guys going as LB36 in our ADP. So right there on that borderline of LB3-4, who ends up top 5 at the position. And what really juices it for Kaden Elliss was that playoff performance. You look by Big 3 scoring, outputs of 24, 23, and 22 points. 4 straight weeks with a sack. Weeks 13 through 16, didn't get a sack in week 17, but had an interception. There was no linebacker hotter to finish the season than Kaden Elliss.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to show that you don't have to have an ADP in the hundreds or in the 80s or 90s to be a value. You can even be a first round pick, and if you outperform expectations enough, that's a great value there.
Yep.
So someone like Ellis, who was being taken more in that LB3 kind of range, who ended up finishing as an LB1, is absolutely a great value. And also, the other thing I love about him is his consistency. In looking at his outputs, there's almost always in the 10s or 20s. His worst week was week 6 against the Panthers. He still had 4 combined tackles and a pass defended. So he's close to 10 points in most scoring systems. So very reliable. A lot of questions about that Atlanta LB room, as was mentioned in the clips a moment ago, going into the season. But I think the discerning folks knew that no matter what happened with Landman and with Anderson, that there was going to be a role for Ellis. I don't think most of us thought the role would be as big and as profitable as it ended up being for him.
Yeah, the output on the sack side was just really impressive for Kaden Elliss this year. You look at his career totals, 5 sacks, doesn't quite match the highs that we saw in 2022 as far as sacks go, but he blew away the tackle total from that year, almost doubling his tackles from 2022 that year in New Orleans. 74 tackles that year, 140 tackles. Sitting as LB3 right now, I think Kaden Elliss has a real shot to finish the season as LB1. Atlanta still fighting for a playoff spot, need a big game from Kaden Elliss. And if history is any indication, my man is going to deliver in Week 18. If any of you are sickos out there with Week 18 championships, you know what I'm talking about. So let's move, though, Scott, to the next player on the list. We are going back to the defensive line, and we are talking about one of the beefy boys in the middle, one of your favorites, and it's actually going to be a player you're going to be discussing as well. But up first, to discuss Leonard Williams of the Seattle Seahawks, it's Addy and Jason King of DLF and the IDP Show. Addy, Jason, take it away. Why was Leonard Williams your choice for IDP MVP?
Happy New Year, my fellow IDP aficionados. This is Jason King with my 2024 IDP MVP. I realize in most leagues this is going to always be a linebacker or an edge rusher, and I have no doubt that this show is going to feature a lot of votes for Zack Baun or Zaire Franklin or Jamien Sherwood or even Andrew Van Ginkel. Those are all fantastic selections. One of the things I love about IDP, though, is the vast array of setups and scoring systems. And so I'm going to dedicate my IDP MVP selection to all of you in those beautiful defensive tackle premium leagues. These are, of course, leagues that require DTs in your starting lineups and stagger the scoring per position. For example, one of my favorite setups, DTs receive 3.5 points per solo tackle and 2 points per assist, while linebackers receive 2 points per solo and 1 point per assist. So with that in mind, for all you fans of football in the trenches, I'm going to go with the big cat, Mr. Leonard Williams of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, Williams didn't exactly get off to a flaming hot start, as a Week 3 rib injury essentially cost him 2 full games, but from Week 6 onward, the big cat was a dog, and over his final 11 games, he was a DT1 6 times and a DT2 another 3 times, and then really put up 3 massive performances when it counted the most. In Week 12, as you were making your playoff push, Williams notched 2.5 sacks, 3 solos, and 3 assists. In Week 13, who could forget the big man intercepting Aaron Rodgers and rumbling 92 yards for a touchdown, adding 2 more sacks, blocking an extra point, and then adding 4 total tackles. And then, of course, in championship week, Week 17 brought another 2 sack performance plus 5 solos. In best ball, you didn't have to pay much for the DT1 on the year, according to the ADP at theidpshow.com. As draft season wound down, Williams was off the board as the DT19 with an ADP of 127.9. And then in Dynasty, he was going to trades for a 5th-round rookie pick or even less. So there you have it. My IDP MVP is defensive tackle Leonard Williams.
Let's get into it. Lots of worthy candidates for IDP MVP in 2024. But I'm going to go with a guy that I don't think has been talked about that much. Leonard Williams. What a year for Mr. Williams. Averaging 16.5 points per game. That is 8th best among all defensive linemen. But listen to this, folks. Since Week 9, Leonard Williams is averaging 23 points per game. That is number 1 among all defensive players. 59 tackles, 9 sacks, 15 TFLs. He had a 91-yard pick six, which was a great reminder that, oh yeah, this dude has a 9.22 RAS and is an incredible athlete. In leagues that use Big Three scoring, Williams has put up 247.3 points across 15 games played this year. That is his best fantasy season of his 10-year career. He's also tearing it up PFF-wise with a career-best 86.4 overall PFF grade this year. That ranks 4th best among all defensive linemen, only trailing Cam Hayward, Dexter Lawrence, and Chris Jones. Among defensive tackles, his 11.9% pressure rate ranks 7th, and his 11.9% pass rush win rate ranks 17th. One last thing about Leonard Williams. If you listen to the show for a while, you've heard us talk about grown-ass men. Think Cam Hayward, Calais Campbell, Khalil Mack, these studs that age well. Because remember, they're already superior athletes, but now they have the experience of being a 10-year vet, so they know what works, what doesn't work. They have invaluable reps and just NFL experience. Leonard Williams is entering into his grown-ass man phase, and he's a piece I want if I'm a contender in a dynasty league. You can probably get this dude for a 4th-round draft time, so no-brainer. Go get some Leonard Williams. Congratulations to Leonard Williams on getting my vote for 2024 IDP MVP. No greater honor, my friend.
Scott, there's a lot that I could say about Leonard Williams, but this was actually your choice for IDP MVP. So, sir, the floor is yours. Why was Mr. Williams your selection as well?
Yeah, so not to just repeat everything that you just heard that's fantastic about Leonard Williams, he is just the definition of an IDP MVP for me. He has value. He was inconsistent, but only at the beginning of the season. In the beginning of the season, we're still trying to figure things out, especially in a Seattle defensive line room that already had Jaron Reed, that added Byron Murphy, that had Draymond Jones. So knowing what they were going to do, I'm doubting many people were starting Leonard Williams early in the season. But from, I know Adam mentioned week 9 on, you can really set that marker pretty much anywhere from week 9 and beyond. I was looking at week 13 or week 12 and beyond, because that's sort of when some of my leagues would have their doubleheaders and the big playoff pushes. Not only the DL1, not only the DT1, but whether you're talking about a flat scoring system or especially in scoring systems where they give some extra juice to the big guys with premium tackles for defensive tackles, number 1 overall IDP player across those last several weeks, which is exactly what you want to see. The chop that was in his performance was early in the season, so that is tolerable. Didn't cost you an arm and a leg to get it, and finished up as the DT1 in most scoring systems. So when I think about my criteria, it is how they finished relative to where they were drafted, and I want them to be one of the top 1 or 2 at their individual position and to be creating some value for you, especially as it goes down the season. Check, check, and check for Leonard Williams for me, which is why he was also my IDP MVP for 2024.
And let's be honest, Scott, this is for the brand. You are the DL streaming guy. And also, he was probably too rostered to make it into your weekly write-ups.
Did not get featured once because, he was
too
a
good.
known quantity.
Yes, he is. And I will say, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I am guessing by Big Three scoring his 59.3-point output in Week 13 against the Jets when he had 4 tackles, 2 sacks, and a pick six, probably the biggest IDP performance of the year in terms of point output. So going to be hard to top a guy that gets 2 sacks and a pick six to go along with 4 tackles.
Yeah, that was a great game to watch, but it was, you have some players who will have that boom week and it's really atypical for them. Yeah. Using sort of the DT premium scoring that I like, he had a 47-point performance the week before that.
Yep.
In week 17, championship week, he had a 41.9-point performance in that scoring system, picking up another 2 sacks and a TFL on top of those sacks that were also TFLs, and 5 solos.
Yep.
So, he just absolutely came through for you when you needed him. I know we complain a little bit sometimes when players have a lot of variance, but when that variance is getting you 40 or 50 or 60 points,
you'll take
and
that.
winning
Yes.
you games, then I will absolutely take that.
Yes, absolutely. He was a known quantity in the NFL. I think that's why you saw the trade. I think that's why you saw the big contract, right? Because I think Leonard Williams was swapped for a second-round pick from the Giants to the Seahawks. He got the big deal there in Seattle. But you're right, there was question marks along the defensive line. I think most NFL analysts would tell you that Leonard Williams was still the best player along that defensive line. This is the year when we saw him become the best IDP asset, because in years past it was Uchenna Nwosu, right? You've had folks believing in some of those other edge rushers who are there. We had high hopes for Byron Murphy and still do, but this was the year Leonard Williams said, no, this is my team, this is my defense, and really richly rewarded IDP managers who placed their faith in him. And the good news was, too, Scott, you didn't have to pay an arm and a leg for this guy. By our ADP, he was DL66, D tackle 19, going at 117.6 overall post-draft.
Yeah.
So that's some delicious value.
Yeah, and I hope this is some consolation for him, because I saw he was pretty rightfully upset when he was a Pro Bowl snub. So at least he has this to fall back
There you
on.
go.
3 IDP
Leonard,
MVP
you're
votes,
welcome.
including from this guy who has a real bias towards defensive tackles.
That
But
you do.
Congratulations on adding this trophy to your mantle, even though you weren't able to go to Orlando for the Pro Bowl.
And even though we don't send out trophies for the IDP MVP selection.
Metaphorical.
Yes, it's a metaphorical, spiritual trophy. So let's keep it rolling, though, Scott. We got 4 more players to get through. And next up, we wondered who was going to emerge on that Seattle defensive line. We felt the same about the Denver Broncos. Zack Allen was a playoff hero. Talked with Jake Colhagen about Zack Allen and his performance, especially in Week 17. I think he had 43 points by Big 3 scoring or something like that. So Zack Allen, absolute stud, especially if he's labeled as a defensive tackle in your league. But the edge rusher who emerged was Nik Bonitto. Baron Browning shipped off to Arizona, so it was Nik Bonitto there. Alongside, who was the Cooper guy? What was Cooper's name?
Jonathan
Cooper. Jonathan Cooper and Nik Bonitto there with Zack Allen. Very fearsome defensive line. I think a large part of the reason this Denver Broncos team has a shot at the playoffs here.
Oh, yeah. And Ellis, the rookie, too.
Yeah, Jonah Ellis
mixing
in.
Good rotation there,
so,
especially at the end.
Yeah, but Nik Bonitto, the guy that emerged finally, and Jake Colhagen and Joey the Tooth are going to show some love to Mr. Bonitto. Take it away, gentlemen.
Jake Colhagen here of the IDP Show, ready to talk to you about my IDP MVP for the 2024 season. I'm really going to lean into the value portion of MVP, and when we talk about value, I really would be hard-pressed not to talk about defensive lineman Nik Bonitto. Based on ADP from the IDP Show Best Ball data, we have him at DL74, Edge 55, and 132 overall when you talk about where Nick was going in the offseason of best ball cycle here. Now, as of Week 17, where did he land for us? Defensive lineman 5 overall. Now, Weeks 1 through 2 were a little rough at 3.25 and 7.5, but this man delivered consistent value for us 11 of the next 12 weeks at 11 plus points every single one of them. He also delivered some beautiful splash weeks for us as we made our playoff runs and into the playoffs of 28, 21, 42, and 31. And I'm sure everyone will remember those 2 pick sixes he had against Jameis and the Colts as well. Now, Week 16 did stink a little bit for us in the playoffs with 2 points, and Week 17 was 10 points for a decent floor. But what he did in terms of the value he delivered us, this is something that you cannot overlook and was a massive gain for any roster, any team that was able to have him and start him almost the entire season. And to me, that's what really delivers the value in our MVP. As a small bonus, I'd like to call out Alontae Taylor of the New Orleans Saints. Again, looking at that data for ADP from Best Balls this offseason, he was DB 90, quarterback 35, and 337 overall. He ended up, as of Week 17, as cornerback or defensive back 4, Massive Week 1, I'm sure we all remember, 43.6 points, 3 sacks. But it wasn't just that propped him up for the entirety of the season. He also delivered the next 10 weeks at 10-plus points every single week. So, again, another massive value for us. He did shift out of the slot defender role into an outside corner, and then that's when he became a lot less consistent for us the rest of the season. But again, Nik Bonitto, Alontae Taylor, my MVPs for the season, and gave us one heck of a ride for the 2024 season. Thank you, and Happy New Year.
I'm coming to you with my IDP show IDP MVP this year. I'm going with Nik Bonitto of the Denver Broncos. He had a great season last year, 30 tackles, 8 sacks, but he really stepped it up this year. 45 tackles, 11.5 sacks. He also had 2 defensive touchdowns and an interception, which ranked him as the IDP 7 overall in IDP show scoring. So Bonitto ended up being the, the number 5 edge overall in the season. So, and for reference, where you could have drafted him, he went in the 15th round of our IDP Madness tournament. So Nik Bonitto was definitely a sleeper all year. I mean, he kind of had a crowded room. There was Baron Browning, there was Jonathan Cooper, and there was him. But he really emerged as the top premier pass rushing option for the Broncos. So to be the number 7 overall IDP option, the number 5 edge, to get him in the 15th round, that's absolutely amazing. So Nik Bonitto, hats off to you, and good job for a great season.
Scott, I have a little bit of a bias against Nik Bonitto because he absolutely put a clown suit on my Indianapolis Colts. Weeks 13 and 15 back-to-back touchdowns for Nik Bonitto. So you saw the kind of upside that Nik Bonitto has. You look at some of the early season logs, once this guy really started to take off, by Big 3 scoring starting in week 3, 13, 15, 11, 14, 17, 13, 7.5, 18, 27, 21, 41, 31. Now, he did let you down in week 16 and 17 of the playoffs when a lot of folks needed him the most, but kind of like we were talking about with Andrew Van Ginkel, Nik Bonitto is one of the guys that took you to that fantasy playoffs.
Absolutely. Likely won you your week 15 matchup, or at least significantly helped with it with the touch. Sorry to keep rubbing salt in the wound, but the touchdown against your Colts. Bonitto is a guy who was an incredible value as well. In the DL streaming article, where I only look at players that are available in 75% or more of IDP leagues, he was featured back in week 3, and I kept featuring him until the market caught up, and suddenly he was not over-rostered, but properly rostered to not be able to be featured anymore. So Bonitto is a splash play waiting to happen, but like you said, from reading off of the metrics before that, he was also putting consistent performances out there for fantasy managers, even when he wasn't having those splash plays. But still finished up the year with 11.5 sacks, 2 defensive touchdowns, 14 tackles for loss, 45 combined tackles. Just lots and lots of things that you love to see out of an edge rusher who has a good floor with a really high upside. And that's not something you always see.
Yeah, he finished as DL5, again, going into Week 18 as we sit here recording this on Saturday, January 4th, only behind TJ Watt, the aforementioned Andrew Van Ginkel, Myles Garrett, and Trey Hendrickson. That's not bad company to have at the top of the DL list. Oh, and Leonard Williams, 10 points behind him by our scoring system. So, and again, this is another, if you're power ranking the guys who are like just tremendous values, this Nik Bonitto is probably in the top 3 or 4. DL 74, edge 55, going post-draft 146.9 overall. So that's like a beginning of the 13th round, you got Nik Bonitto post-draft.
And one of, if not the youngest player featured in all of these nominations. Only 25, just turned 25 in September. Still a young guy, 3 years in the league, lots of upside left. We've had a lot of veterans who have had resurgences or breakouts, and we'll be talking about breakout here shortly. But lots of guys who were known commodities coming into the season, or who might be just sort of peaking or at the tail end of their peak. We probably haven't seen the best of Nik Bonitto yet. Granted, the sack numbers tend to be fluky and can regress from time to time, but given his age and the position he plays, a phenomenal dynasty asset to have.
A guy who, could 12 sacks be the ceiling? Possibly, but I think the more likely outcome is that this guy has 14, 15 sacks in his range of outcomes. Should be a guy that consistently gets you double-digit sacks, I would think. Because like you said, still an ascending player. Great dynasty asset and an IDP MVP for sure in 2024. But this next player was one of the two guys that we thought was going to be on the list, featured heavily, and sure enough, here he is, tied with Andrew Van Ginkel with 4 nominations apiece. He is the co-IDP MVP for the 2024 season. It is Zack Baun, Philadelphia Eagles linebacker. And talking up Mr. Baun, we are going to have Eric Harms, Jackson Swam, Kyle Bellyfuel, and Tobias Stark from the Mikes in Motion podcast. So, gentlemen, tell us why the Eagles linebacker was your IDP MVP.
Hi guys, I'm Toby from Mikes in Motion, the only IDP podcast from Germany. Thanks for having me. You asked me about my IDP MVP of the season, and it's a linebacker who I think nobody really had him on his list. I think maybe in the 50s at best as a solid linebacker 3, but nobody thought that he could have a breakout season like this. Talking about Zack Baun, Wisconsin guy, former Saints player, now Philadelphia Eagles on a 1-year prove-it deal, and man, he proved it, definitely. Don't know what the future is bringing for him. Definitely a contract somewhere, but come on. 150 combine tackles, 3.5 sacks, 5 forced fumble, 1 fumble recovery, 1 interception. Damn it. What freaking numbers. I think he's linebacker 3 overall in your ranking, combined with the outside linebackers. So he's linebacker 1 for inside linebacker. So you could snatch him in late rounds, maybe even from the waivers. So yeah, that's my MVP.
Hey everyone, it's Kyle B from the Football Guys checking in with my IDP MVP for this season. My pick for this year is Philadelphia linebacker Zack Baun. Baun is likely to get a few more votes from those calling in, and for good reason. Baun is a former third-round pick of the Saints back in 2020, but was a positional tweener who failed to take the reins and earned a prominent role while in New Orleans. However, fast forward to the 2024 season. Baun signed a 1-year deal with Philly this offseason and ran with the opportunity he earned. Through 17 weeks, Baun has produced a stellar 151 tackles, 93 of the solo type, 11 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, 1 interception, and 5 forced fumbles. That beautiful stat line ranks him 3rd amongst linebackers in Big 3 scoring and the 2nd overall linebacker via Football Guys scoring. If you listen to the buzz surrounding Baun during Philly's training camp and or preseason leading up to week 1 and were able to scoop him up off waivers, you got yourself an LB1 for just the price of a mouse click. Thank you, Zack Baun, for being an IDP stud this season, and thank you all for listening to me ramble on here. The biggest of shout-outs to the good-looking fellas over at the IDP Show, and I hope you all had a happy holidays and have a happy new year. Peace out.
All right, so for my 2024-2025 IDP MVP, I'm going with Zack Baun. It's for a multitude of reasons, but first and foremost, I was able to snag him in the 15th round of our IDP Madness League 2 there. So he's got a special place in my heart. But really also just the production on paper. I mean, 150 tackles, 3.5 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, fumble recovery, and an INT. Like, this guy just stuffed the stat sheet and was good for LB1 on the season. So kind of an easy choice for me there. I'm going with Zack Baun.
Last year, I struggled a little bit with this. There were a lot of good options last year. This year, not so much. No-brainer for me. It is Zack Baun, Philadelphia Eagles linebacker. The guy had a phenomenal season, and you most likely got him off the waiver wire. He finished 4th most in points using Big 3 scoring, behind TJ Watt, Andrew Van Ginkel, and Myles Garrett, just ahead of Zaire Franklin and Trey Hendrickson. Great company. In fact, all those guys but Van Ginkel were top 24 IDP players taken, and Van Ginkel was still 200 picks ahead of Baun. Just an amazing season. Most of us didn't believe some of the preseason hype. Still didn't think he'd beat out Devin White, even though we're not big fans of Devin White either. Baun just hadn't done anything, but he proved us all wrong. Had a fantastic season. Him and Jamien Sherwood were waiver wire darlings, but he still scored 50 more points than Jamien Sherwood as well. So Zack Baun to me is the fantasy football IDP MVP for 2024. Have a healthy and successful new year.
Andrew Van Ginkel, Zack Baun, both the biggest values, Scott, and I think that's the reason we see them here as the co-IDP MVPs for 2024, 4 votes apiece. We mentioned earlier Andrew Van Ginkel's ADP. Well, Zack Baun, LB 93, going at 335 post-draft. Pre-draft ADP, overall ADP 287.3. So a guy that caught a lot of buzz as the offseason went along. You had the defensive coordinator in Philadelphia, Vic Fangio, talking up Zack Baun. He was getting first-team reps. The beat writers were all beating the drum for Zack Baun. And us IDP managers, I think by and large, were like, are we sure about this? Like, is this just off-season smoke? No, it was not. Zack Baun, a complete revelation, one of the best linebackers in the league, sitting as the LB1 right now by Big Three scoring. Probably not going to play a whole lot in Week 18, so one of the other guys behind him might catch up to him. But tremendous season from Zack Baun. What do you think moving forward, though, Scott? I don't think there's really a whole lot we can add to the analysis of his 2024 season. I think our compatriots did that pretty well. But what do you think about Zack Baun moving forward? You think he gets the big deal? Is he a secure asset for Dynasty?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely highly valued by his team, and for good reason. I know you mentioned he might not get many snaps. I just saw that he's been announced out. Coach's decision. They're resting him.
So no snaps at all.
That shows you how much they value him.
That's right.
And like you mentioned, he might finish as LB1, LB2, depending on what happens behind him from a fantasy perspective. He has also pretty much locked up the race for PFF's top-graded LB for the season. Fred Warner is presumably going to play this week, but he's still a full point plus behind Baun's rating. So, yeah, I think this isn't one of those situations where it's a Zach Cunningham, where he's putting up great fantasy numbers, but
he stinks.
The real,
yeah,
he's
not good.
Trying to find a nice way
to
say
tiptoe around it. Sorry, Zach Cunningham, if you're listening.
Yeah, and I guess it's just the Zach thing made it pop into my head, but no, Baun is actually playing great and helping fantasy managers. I don't think the latter part of that analysis is going to help him get a bag, but the front end is.
Yeah.
The fact that he is showing that he can do it. He was on a 1-year prove-it deal, as you know we heard a couple of times in the recent clips. He absolutely did prove it. So I think he will get the bag. Where that will be a really interesting question and interesting to see how things shake out. We always have some surprise cuts that happen right before free agency starts, some retirements and things like that. I think it's going to be a really fun free agency year to watch, but I think Baun will be one of the most interesting free agency acquisitions for whoever gets him.
Yeah, I wanted to see here. I always love looking up to see, guys who are set to be free agents. Like, what kind of market can we expect for these guys to have? I think you could see. Now, do we think he gets like the Tremaine Edmonds type of contract? What was like 4 years, $72 million? I don't think so. I think the fact that Edmonds was young and highly drafted, I think carries a lot of weight with NFL GMs. But could you see I don't know, 3 years, $45 million for Zack Baun, $15 million a year? Could you see something like that? Could he get, 16 a year? Could he get 3 years, 54, like, $18 million a year? So I think he is going to be somewhere in that 15 to 20 per year range. I think it'll be a 2 to 3 year deal, probably a 3-year deal with an out after the second year. And I would be stunned if Philadelphia does not bring this guy back. This is a good team. This is a Super Bowl probably favorite in the NFC. And especially if this team does well in the postseason, I think they're going to bring this guy back.
Yeah, and the nice
whatever
thing,
the cost.
Yeah, the nice thing is they're also a very young team, especially when you think about their defense. Their secondary outside of C.J. Gardner-Johnson is all relatively young. Their front four is all pretty young. They don't have a lot of money tied up in their players right now, so they should have some room to maneuver to be able to keep him, unless someone just throws stupid, Tremaine Edmonds kind of money at him, which I don't think that we'll see that. I was just looking back at some of the the highest valued linebackers from last year. Patrick Queen got 3 years at 13.67. I would imagine Baun would eclipse that, but Luvu got 3 years at 10.3. So we'll see what he gets. I think he is definitely going to be the highest compensated linebacker in this class. I think it's going to exceed that of the highest compensated linebacker from the 2024 free agency group. But, all it takes is one team.
All it takes is one team.
Look at Christian Kirk's contract and Kenny Golladay before him, not to talk about offense. But, there's been lots of players throughout there. Bryce Huff, there we go.
Mm-hmm.
There's an IDP who got a big old bag and
disappeared.
Yeah.
Disappeared into
or
a
one
black
that
hole.
literally disappeared.
Yes.
Hassan Reddick. And,
yes.
He just
gone to Japan.
Yep. So, teams, all it takes is one team to give you a big old contract. And I think he is going to get one. How big? That'll be fun to watch.
Yeah, I think he's a secure asset for Dynasty, but like we always say, I'm more than happy to sell that kind of outlier performance, which this was the outlier of all outliers. Yeah. This guy was literally a cast-off from New Orleans. We joked, he's sort of like the reverse Hassan Reddick, where he was miscast as an edge rusher. You put him at off-ball linebacker, and he finds his groove and is one of the best graded linebackers by PFF this year. Number one over even Fred Warner, the PFF darling. So I think that he has a bright future in the NFL. I think he has a bright future in IDP. I think he's a great sell because if you can go get a second-round pick for Zack Baun, I think I'm cashing out. Are you cashing out for a second or holding?
Oh, I'm cashing out on almost any IDP that I would get a first or second for.
I think if you can get a second, and I think some people would pay because – it's one thing to be an IDP producer, but like you said, what sets Zack Baun apart and gives me hope is sort of that same thing with like Fred Warner, where he's an actual good NFL linebacker. So I don't worry about the trapdoor being under his feet as much as someone like you mentioned, Patrick Queen. Mm-hmm. Could that be a surprise cut this offseason and suddenly Peyton Wilson is the talk of the town? So not to get too far down the offseason rabbit hole, but it is exciting. So we've got one more linebacker here, Scott, and no surprise. It comes from Mike Wohlert, and it comes from my favorite team, the Indianapolis Colts. Mike is going with Zaire Franklin, and let's hear him make the case why Mr. Franklin was his IDP MVP.
What is going on, everybody? This is Mike Wohlert, the ranker, Green Dot article writer for the IDP Show with the 2024 IDP MVP. A lot of options this year. I think that you're probably going to hear a lot of Jamien Sherwood, Zack Baun, might get a Trey Hendrickson here or there, but I am going to go with Indianapolis Colt linebacker Zaire Franklin. A couple of reasons. One, he had the best availability. The only off-ball linebacker and potentially the only one of the only IDPs to play 100% of the snaps. With all of the injuries at the linebacker position sustained, he managed to stay on the field for all 100% of the Colts defensive snaps. Two, his production just, unmatched. 3 games of fewer than 12 fantasy points. He was probably the number 1 overall at IDP in most tackle-heavy formats and most balanced formats. He averaged 18.1 fantasy points per game. He had 8 games of 10-plus tackles. 6 of those games were 11-plus tackles, and he is on the precipice of another 170 tackle season. He's 5 away. He had a 15.2% tackle rate on over 1,000 snaps. Most importantly, unlike another linebacker I was probably going to pick, he came up big in the championship week, in the most important week, where he recorded 14 tackles and a forced fumble. So he was definitely, he came up big for you in the big game. But yes, my IDP MVP for the 2024 season Indianapolis Colts linebacker Zaire Franklin.
Zaire Franklin, obviously a great choice, Scott. He was a highly drafted linebacker, but, you know, we said before, with those studs, with those guys that are highly drafted, we need to see them perform in those big moments, and that was Zaire Franklin, absolutely in fuego in the playoffs. This was a guy who took you to the playoffs, and then if you dance with the girl you brought, like we like to say on this show, he richly rewarded you. Look at the 5-week span starting in week 12, bye week in week 14. 24 points, 35 points, 26 points. Let you down a little bit in week 16, just 6.75 points, 7 tackles. But in the championship against the Giants, 30 points, 14 tackles, and 1 forced fumble. I talked a lot about Zaire Franklin at the end of last season. I said, just give this guy a little bit of a pass. He was banged up at the end of the 2023 season. I think he is going to be just fine. And sure enough, he was. He rewarded those managers who drafted him highly. And draft him highly they did. LB7, but you mentioned there can still be value with those early picks. He was basically end of the second round, 23.6 overall by ADP, and is probably going to finish the season as LB1 because he's 2 points behind Zack Baun, and Baun is not playing. So through 18 weeks, Zaire Franklin will be your LB1 more than likely.
Yeah, and the other great thing about him, even though he was drafted very highly, you had to pay a lot to get him, he's still a value to me because he outperformed what he did last year.
That's right.
So if you put that faith in him to go out and spend a high draft pick on him, he not only met that bar that he had set in 2023, but exceeded it. And so, to me, and you didn't really see that if you look across the other top linebackers. Warner, we know he's been dinged up some this season, but his output has dropped significantly. I'm trying to think of who else. TJ Edwards, Roquan Smith. A lot of these guys aren't putting up the numbers that they put up in 2023.
Foye was another one.
Who was banged up.
That's probably a good argument for why Zaire is even more valuable, is a lot of these highly drafted linebackers just didn't perform up to their usual standards. I mean, you look at Foye, LB1, Fred Warner, or Roquan Smith, LB2, Fred Warner, LB3, Bobby Okereke, LB4, Ernest Jones, LB5, Nik Bolton, LB6, and Zaire Franklin, LB7. Far and away the best LB pick of that bunch right there.
Absolutely.
And is on pace. As long as he plays his normal amount of snaps, he is 6 points off of his incredible 2022 finish when he had 166 tackles, 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and 272 points by Big Three scoring, sitting at 266 points right now. So, as long as he is healthy and available in week 18, going to be his best season ever from a fantasy perspective. Pretty fun.
Yeah.
Fun player.
Can't ask for much more than that.
So he was actually going to be my choice. I just wanted to pivot away just to give a little more love to the DBs and also to bring a fresh name to the forefront for you all. So I mentioned a little earlier that mine was going to be a defensive back. We've had Brian Branch and Brandon Jones on this program already. Well, let's bring up another DB name here, Scott, and I'm going with Budda Baker. Now, I was going to go with Zaire Franklin. What I mentioned earlier, I did want to bring forth a fresh name. Also still just a little bit flustered by the Week 17 no-show against the Giants and him and EJ Speed yapping on their podcast about beating a 4-11 Giants team and then you get boat raced by the team with the number 1 overall pick. I'm not bitter, folks. I'm not bitter at all. But more than that, really, I truly wanted to honor an IDP stalwart who has returned to form in a huge way in 2024. That's why I went with Budda Baker, who through 17 weeks already has his best season ever in terms of fantasy output. This is in large part thanks to his outrageous tackle total, y'all. 155 combined tackles, second in the NFL only to the aforementioned Zaire Franklin, who's a linebacker, as we know. Budda Baker's previous tackle high, 147. Remember, we got 1 week to go, y'all. He's also matched his career sack high with 2 and has played 98% of the snaps this season. But performance, that's only one part of the IDP MVP equation for me. Another part is price. If you get a discount on a stud like we've been talking about, that makes them more valuable to your roster. And after a couple of down years, Budda Baker going as DB20, safety 17, sitting as the safety 2 currently. And he was a 15th round selection post-draft, down a full round from his pre-draft ADP. Now, I also factor playoff performance into the MVP equation, and he wasn't getting you those 20 and 30-point weeks that he had throughout the season in weeks 15 through 17, but he averaged 10.75 points per game and had 23 tackles. And after several studs crapped the bed in the playoffs, Budda Baker was solid, so we'll take it. He also got a contract extension from the Cardinals on December 17th, securing his future in Arizona. He is a top 5 safety now for Dynasty, and my 2024 IDP MVP, Scott. It was really fun seeing Budda Baker round back into form in 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. He's someone who I've had my eye on since he was a rookie and came out with a cornerback designation as a cheat code for about a week before MFL at least fixed that and shifted him over to safety. But a couple other quick accolades that you didn't mention: 9 tackles for loss.
There we go.
That's tied for lead among safeties with only Derwin James, but obviously his other numbers well exceed James's this season. And you mentioned that an obscene tackle number, 91 of them are solos.
That's incredible.
So if you play in a league that rewards solo tackles over assists, and especially a league that has safety premium or things like that, Budda could have very well been a league winner for you. Because in my home league, the gap between Budda and even like a Kyle Hamilton, who was safety 6, is 60 points.
That's big.
So, absolutely could have helped you win some individual games, maybe even helped you win your league. And like you, I'm also very glad to see that resurgence, and I'm sure he will be a much more highly drafted safety in terms of his ADP for the upcoming draft season, which I'm already looking forward to. And talking about these guys,
I know, gets you excited,
about,
right?
Okay, where am I going to put them in terms of? So yeah, Budda Baker, great pick.
Yeah, he'll be a top 5 drafted safety, I think. Mm-hmm. I think you'll still see, I think Winfield might drop a little bit because of what happened this season, which was mainly due to injury. But I think Caham will still be up there. I think Branch will still be up there. I think Jesse Bates will still be up there. And I think Budda's going to vault himself into McKinney. I'd say will be up there as well. Green Bay Packers, Xavier McKinney. I think rookie Tyler Gitchen-Nubin will be shuffling up the board as well. But yeah, Budda's going to be safety 4 or 5 is going to be my prediction by ADP. So we'll fire those drafts up soon and find out.
Yeah, we talked about Leonard Williams' metaphorical award that he'd be getting. Well, Budda Baker's great accolade that he can add to his accomplishments will be his rise in IDP Show, Best Ball ADP for 2025.
That and the millions of dollars that he just secured on his new contract. It's been a nice little stretch here, nice little month for Budda Baker. So thank you all so much for tuning in. That does it for the 2024 edition of the IDP MVP episode. Thanks to all the analysts and friends who sent in clips for this show. It was a lot of fun hearing the rationale behind the choices. Like we said, Scott, MVP valued and defined a little differently from everyone, but that's what makes this show fun. You get to take this however you want and spin it however you want. We saw some values. We saw some studs who came up big. We saw some monster playoff performances. That's what makes this show a lot of fun, and it's a nice little cap to the season. Way to look back on the year that was. Thank you so much, my friend, for driving down from Lexington to spend the day talking MVPs with me.
Yeah, always happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and we'll recap the season in full on the next episode of the IDP Show. We are going to be looking at season splits. So the first 9 weeks of the season, the last 9 weeks of the season, who got hot and cooled off and vice versa, who was hot the whole season, who was cold the whole season. We're going to break it down on the next episode of the IDP Show, which will be coming at y'all in 2 weeks. Reminder, we'll be every other week in the off season, but in those weeks that we are not dropping an episode, check out the IDP after show. Jay Sabby is going to be having some of the smartest minds from across the IDP landscape on that show. We'll even have Scott on there from time to time, so it's going to be a lot of fun. And all the same coverage you've come to expect from the IDP Show, we will have just split across the IDP After Show and the IDP Show. So go subscribe to the after show wherever you get your podcast. Make sure to follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/@the-IDP Show. You can get all of our shows in video format over there, and we have some very exciting YouTube stuff in the works for you all as well. So congratulations to all of you champions out there. Who is your IDP MVP for 2024? If you are watching on YouTube, drop it in the comments. If you're listening to the podcast version, send us a tweet at the IDP Show. Let us know who was your IDP MVP. But enjoy the football. It's Week 18, NFL playoffs right around the corner. We're going to have some cool stuff coming up for you all over at the website, theidpshow.com. But until next time we see you all, take care, enjoy the football, and we'll see you soon.
It's the